Okay, we're good. Anyone not ready? Okay. The CIA ran drug trafficking operations to fund the contrast with devastated urban growth and created the cycle of black imprisonment and mass murder. This is web. In 1960, for decades, San Francisco drug control, Towson cocaine, like that, LA, fundamentally drug off the American real army, remember the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency drug network over the first pilot between Columbia and some cocaine cartels and black neighborhoods, one of the first and most desirable alliances in the modern history, U.S. black army, and gangster accounts and South LA, and metal CIA agents, unaware supplies, military and political connections, two-way rape, turn the cocaine powder, crack, and cold to the gang, trust, currently while the FDNs are. This belly member did black Americans still dealing with this place in the second, like thousands of young black men are serving my president for his own cocaine and drug research. And by never between them before that, CIA started bringing to the South Central and Burgundy surprised the entire box of major cities and occasional war zones. 5,000 men and FDM was created with CIA command centers and groups of pirates, communists, exiles, and she's been the drug control to start cocaine. London was running full-time informant for the DEA. People admitted the crimes would have set others away for liability. Justice Department turned them loose, and the kickstarted the war on drugs, which further criminalized black flesh in the American psyche. This is Alexander 10. The American administration launched a mass campaign of the drug wars and national offices, horror stories, compelling black crime users and characters that get a communities, crack cocaine, creating program to the American administration built support for the war. It was afraid of media images to get the national orders for drug food and hiding in the planet of explained by new siege paradigm to the district report. White users and these and viewers and these consistent with numerous other studies and studying network television news from 1990 to 1991 just against information used administration cement until fighting images of black drug criminal. The children was connected last convention drug users discovered that person in college journal alcohol and drug education 95% picture of black drug users same group responsible for the typical drug traffickers black ones. Suggests standard crime trip. So the early makes the viewers that the magic black perpetrator would not exist. 60% of viewers will solid no image falsely. 77% believe the perpetrator to be African American matrix keeps operating without conscious awareness or intent. One study involved when video place photographs of white and black individuals holding a gun or an object. Par is more likely to mistake black targets arm when he does not. Studies indicate that black people have become increasingly harsh by alleged criminals, darker, more stereotypically black. The research by cognitive social psychologists again suggests racial bias and trouble is inevitable. The court that rules the maximize racial discrimination that likely occur whenever it's the United States. The court believes some non-officers are free to use minor traffic violations. Some orders for investigations that court reject petition central criminal rules and racial laws will not be run on the Fourth Amendment. The Supreme Court has been emergency possible challenge to the criminal justice system under the Fourth Amendment and bar litigation such things under federal civil rights laws. And we move our story about the model minority in the opium fields of Southeast Asia, where the CIA is playing a major role in the development of Golden Triangle. This is Bitcoin 10. The CIA reported for the heroin manufacturing processing water rock was open today. The only market outlets to the United States and U.S. military political activities, but a specific role should be still just one to attach the CIA support for their counterinsurgency working. One day out of the report that 90% of opium harvest is carried by national Chinese army mule caravans when inviting the law enforcement stock risk cannot turn airlines and opium business. CIA's airline American land flying mule opium out of the hills in Montana, Vietnam. The support to the CIA claims to see whether the Golden Triangle heroin treatments reviewed by the agency. Some of the legal reporting substitution opium traffic. The CIA now identified 21 opium refineries. These refineries were located in the area totally controlled by paramilitary groups, including the former CIA African heroin. Instituted by Mashallah, the commander of the Yamash Troops were working for the CIA more northwestern Laos. One of the heroin labs on General Al-Qaeda was the only army in the world entirely financed by the U.S. government. One of the more captures to the head share of the Sham States opium trade with all the shadow of army closely allied with the CIA. The U.S. Bureau of Narcotics reports that Gentile, the commander of the CIA secret army, has been operating heroin factories on headquarters of CIA operations in northern Laos. And that's the formation of the Golden Triangle steeped in European semi-colonialism and driven by Western greed. This is McCoy. Then after French military recall, several hundred French workers on the schedule stayed on 14 meters over them. They started to number of airlines and air opium. These airlines began to control lessons into the drug market selling around the aviation pioneers and developed from Frontier Air Force officer Sully Levent. There was a number for public risk and gangsters, the numerous amount of shipping between Southeast Asia and Europe that was pretty to be as a transshipment point to substantial numbers of French traders here in Cruise Hill, the Social Director Marseille, and the idea that all minorities used to oppress Asian American guerrillas as a method for the U.S. to undermine black political resistance. This fabrication created by white supremacy as a tool to create submissive docile and invisible Asian subject. This is Young and 12. Asian American ability the right to harbor intelligence bigger armor to recommend the black power movement in 1969. The New York Times said the successor of Japanese American style brought the concept of Mago minority was the hardworking values without running from legal poem minority implications. Black political resistance was a real problem. Conservative elites fabricated the right for U.S. crime problem just by saving oppression social movements and putting the black power movements the right conservative more power or the crime to control the democracy. U.S. put the race problem and then criminalized the concept of model minority method versus Asian Americans law-abiding hardworking implicitly enforcing the permanent criminalization of blackness, and the Asian Americans are subjected into the violence as a result of the narrative of black criminality could only resist by allowing themselves within the black-white binary since Young 14. Which is paying attention to the border trail, black bodies, comments, one of the raging left fire beneath the actual content that do not move across the policing system as an Asian American black race occupies an important place. I come from war. Hey, you will control out by trying to live Asian progressive style, I hold my own race. As part of my identity, the American culture, black country, dehumanizing the narrative, black criminality, South Asian narrative, minority, resources, and narrative, Asian death, render, visible, and known as the right to the power structure, Asian lives, lifestyles, I said, the minority, and orientals, and narratives, doesn't proper structure of sexualism, and meritocracy doesn't measure visibility, Asian death, and now Asian American identity is played by minority, black race, a whole such important our nations moving toward two societies, one black, one white, one separate, and unequal. Asian Americans end up in between like just minus which they're visible, struggling, the option cross trying to often read different words, not black, is our options, visibility, publicity, resistance, black, race to 12% of the correct center, the color line, Asian American is not monolithically, occupied both as an economic spectrum, most in the demographic identified ethnicity, not by Western critique of the nation, youth economy, black political system, rooted in that black is keeping their place between, but taking position within a separate, but unequal, or the white is black, either left or in the color line, there's no sitting out. Asian American identity is formed by black women, liberation struggle, centered, emancipation, and imperialism, we do the harm of healing, means our and states found violence over criminalization of black and brown people must end forever, and education violence, so purposes all forms mutually enforcing mess off, black criminality, minority of no place, vision, Ferguson, does Ferguson matter for Asian Americans? Yes. Next. Anti-blackness is the fulcrum of white supremacy, meaning that any serious challenge to account for it must account for it. This is not the government 14. They say the folks in white life being forced to binary putting not black people covered criminals, problems in the middle, and black race is fulcrum of white supremacy. Fulcrum is defined by its word, which is legal returns and one has supplies capability for action. There is a binary which white people just one side with force and attention today that force the fulcrum of anti-blackness, racism, racist slavery, is historical basis for economy, federal system, business, slavery, overture rights, federal elections, are the close all anti-black races, superior black people, that's natural politics of climate, they propaganda where there's no hierarchy of oppression where race is concerned, but anti-black racism is the fulcrum of white supremacy. Therefore, arealize the model minority beauty is a means for challenging the anti-black violence of the drug war waged by the United States federal government, and the role of the ballot is to vote for whomever best ideologically and argumentatively disrupts the criminalization of the black body. And next. The model minority community is a crucial space to dismantle institutions that perpetuate state violence and cheap power. In fact, in favor of black liberation, this is Young and 14, that's Black Lives Matter, it's all said all black lives, model minority community is a call to its complicity in the system, it's opening to announce marginalization of Americans, vulnerable to state violence, refugees of war, carried by 6 American profiling, carried ruler, carried glorious job, the informal economy, incarcerated undocumented trans, disabled, queers, women, dark skins, seeking Muslims, invitation to Americans unite to dismantle apparatuses to state violence, white believe that they're targeting the system, the Carolinas, and the divided health nation, this reality, the issue justice, radical class movements, have the one changes, necessitated, forced and exile, the model minority myths pull the Asian American movement off the we need newspapers, armor, substance, knowledge, and tools to build authentic relationships to also strategically shift power, Black Lives Matter, something that space, and this is shit in certain time. Asian American voices have communicated and now lift ourselves at the expense of others, but the link arms with others, taking up the opportunity for black liberation and the existence of the black white binary was created by the settler state to use Asian Americans as legitimizing anti-blackness. Asian Americans must flip back binary and align with black resistance to fight white subjugation. This is Young in 1013. We revalue the minority status owned by white elites, immense power of who they reach all the numbers as possible, resolve their PR problem, anti-like racism, and legitimacy to model freedom. The racial reputation when elites offered, if you simply stand up and settle, so you behavior will let you hustle for your property to go on. Be white, but white elites will be black, will be opposed to child American dreams together, we will smash these services, ends our fortune, the war, like set up a massive political principle that relies on turning on the white fear of black, crime, and white supremacy, seesaws just from giving more supervised by participating in the exclusion and expectation of other neoliberalism. It's a zero sum cage, the idea of black criminality, convincing to policing, and best course, which are necessary. Asian Americans, the anti-black and settle watching this focus to maintaining white economic political dominance as Asian Americans, we decided we were alongside Black Chicano Native American liberation groups, understanding ourselves as insurgent subjects of U.S. empire liberation, defense of freedom. We take it back in time, the world is changing. So if we, the racial justice movement needs us to experience the war, the intestine of anti-black racism, necessary to dismantle apparatuses of state violence, committed as Yuri Kuchiyama, was black liberation experience, also shit to think about the mess of Hamagambi states, Japanese king's commitments to non-violence, criminalization, domestic place of imperialism. We are stronger together. It's been time for Asian Americans on these minority community like arms to show black liberation together, fighting to the world right side up, let's create a unite front against white supremacy, and blackness was being included in the analysis of Asian oppression because construction of the model minority based on the criminalization of berating the black body. This is Kim and 14. Song highlighting the entanglement between black and Asian American through civil society. Asian Americans become less of a model whose success was specifically the rape rights war, super minority whose success was rape everyone, which include the black distinguished any discussion when minority concern insinuates there's antithesis to the model. People of African descent have the greatest unity in that category. Asian American status as super minority opposed to Michelle Alexander, recently diagnosed with color by product consensus and personal traits, responsible consensus for the majority of black men of the criminal justice system. For politics to become legible, it must celebrate all such subjects as APR human, which regular structural antagonism as during black bodies is always already non-human. The only by attending to structural antagonism that blackness can be wrong to interpret when it comes to human is invoked, it has the effect of putting under erasure the blackness grammar of suffering.
Okay, got it.
All right, what is anti-blackness?
Anti-blackness, we think it's part of the large structure of civil society that places bodies who've been placed in the black side of the binary and directs antagonism toward that. I'm sorry?
In what ways?
In what ways? Well, the way that the app contextualizes one way is through the war on drugs and the recent push to the war on crime.
Well, I guess, how does the model minority community challenge the war on drugs?
Yes. Well, it challenges the criminalization, which is of the black body, which is at the heart of the war on drugs. Their argument is that the way.
Sorry, how?
We say that when we break what has been used as the antithesis to like black criminality that white supremacy has been using, using us as the example of like the minority that can make it inciting our
So
like, we get
criminalization of blackness is premised on the myth of the minority.
It's not premised on it, but the model minority myth plays into it.
Yeah, we read a piece
What
of
else
young
plays
evidence.
into it? So how do you resolve that?
Well, we would say that if white supremacy garners power from this model minority
Sure,
myth,
but you said
challenging it in
that's,
this
you said
instance.
that's one of the ways. What are the other ways that white supremacy gains a form of power to criminalize blackness?
Sure, we would say another way is in the CIA's complicity in the Dark Alliance, their ability to use state action to be able to have these like racist covert action. This is another way that they have
So
gone in their
you
mind.
disengage from state action,
Yes.
and that's what your job indicates that model minority community encourages is a disengagement from state action.
Yes.
Sure. Okay, we'll talk about that. What does it mean to strategically shift power?
I'm just pointing to a specific piece of evidence,
This
or
is your Dell 14 evidence.
which one? I'm sorry.
The solvency mechanism for the act directly.
Oh, right. Yes. The argument is that by refusing to uphold that idea of like the perfect minority, it is a kind of not really shift in power, but rather a shift in the positionality of Asian Americans on the black market.
Dell evidence says to strategically shift power. So what does that mean? I get that you don't think that that's what that means.
I mean, we think, well, okay, so it's post-affirmative, we would endorse. Right now, Asian Americans are upheld on the white side of the binary. Our argument is that by building coalitions, by refusing to affirm that and be a tool of white supremacy, that would be ability to strategically shift power to black liberation movements. Our young evidence also, like historically makes these arguments like model minority myth was used to suppress black political resistance in the 60s.
What does it mean to arm ourselves with knowledge? And what do we do once we acquire that knowledge?
Well, our argument is like the 1AC was a like form of knowledge production, like all speech acts are.
And like examples of this knowledge is like the CIA's complicity in acts like destroying the Golden Triangle, the Dark Alliance.
Okay, so I guess a model minority would, I guess, analyze that knowledge and determine concrete grassroots political actions based off of that knowledge.
I mean, we don't need to determine what that concrete grassroots action is, but we say in the context of this debate round, that.
Okay, what does it mean to include blackness in an analysis of Asian oppression, which is your last piece?
The last piece of Kim evidence, it's the affirmative. It's the idea that blackness and Asian American, the model minority myth are intertwined, at least in recent history.
Sounds good. Okay. Can you catch?
Yeah.
Not really.
That's a good question to ask. What about us in the way, man? Yeah, I can't jump about that. You want to use our step?
Go first, this is what you did. Now I'm gonna have
I should start. I should start.
she just came, did you say this? This needs to come out. This needs to go back.
What's going on?
Theorizations of blackness need to begin with the black naked genie. Alternative leaves black women behind in trans cases. James of 13 Afro-realism compounds of theoretical meditation, political practices, and conceptualized freedom is a resilience that allows for continuous agency configured in the Atlantic slave trade, challenged by the reemergence of the Chicago rebellions of unity of rich capital rich free repatriated. America's Afro-realism journey moves adjacent to democracy, originating, reproducing about Abbott, racial casting, and racial races, ones of the black nation, black nation allows for a broader grasp of black state and citizenship, terror, root agency for freedom reform, marine philosophy, Afro-realism, political theory to move beyond the habitual militarized borders to serve and evolves in the fact towards the black nation, black reproductivity, democracy, suppressing against black nations as a terror, against black reproductive labor and sexual racial rape is described here as the intimate violations of black reproductivity, the terror against black reproductivity, Afro-realism, local cause of race scrutiny to the sexual assault of black reproductivity under the theorized future of the black captivity, reproductive viewpoints of the black features, society, symbolic and interior subjugation that where the murdering philosopher with the concept of racial capital overshadows racial outline of democracy's boundaries, control of the terrors obscured against black features to shape those borders, Afro-realism redirects the moral philosophy, exterior defective, productivity, interior reproductivity, race, gender differences, and masculine energy, black suffering, violence against the female forms, black emergence, female child, and visible and combating that black exploitation, trauma, white supremacy, and holding of black female trauma into the black male frame, thus the common perception of black suffering become representation of trauma and the amounts of consideration may become soon of the racial capital of the years about violence that constitute slavery and massacre country proud of the black nations displacing from the philosophical and increasing subjugation by those who know themselves are against black nations who rate patriarchal racial and sexual violence, economic apartheid, terrorists, weak black nations see civilized democracy and democracies and fellowship and roots, demystification to the foreign culture as well as injustice in black nations wounds, terrifyingly beautiful because the violence they transcend is a rupture commission will political protest politicized but this transform these tragedies into a breach in democracy's concern wire and we want to see this affirmation of the modern minority unity is one that burns the continuation of Black Lives Matter movement replicates the same silence of transition and one of which turns the cases started 2015 down with parents to share the collective prayer doing rally in Ohio, scheduling embracement and women engaged for transphobia, conversation made me feel very unsafe because I didn't know what people were doing that safe and transition level told the group that this snack of our lower happiness in today's worthy of life to save and use it up there whatever didn't want to feel the movement goes and said we each flash from real life. There's the black community acknowledged fear beginning completely silent about the workers that have been happening in our community last year. 12 trans women who killed color because we're in the middle of no responsible black community with wild folks feeling practice all Black Lives Matter are not talking about black trans women and the one I see call for minority mutiny has come to signal the hallmark of post-civil rights era which an attempt to strategically integrate Asian Americans' experience into civil society, which obscures structural antagonism into black and reduce violence and sex and 10 the call for paradigm become the hallmark of post-civil rights era and multi-racial coalition politics immigrants rights and liberal multicultural conservative public governments operating musically on being strategic integration deployment statistics when the conflict is active outside the political antagonism involving within they cannot be satisfied by organization and process the ride range exploitation and exclusion while the matter indicates a single identity racial slavery and afterlife absent paradox of sentient and being failed with crushing the objecthood and ultimately bushwalls and fight for without the political barrier for moral mobility resiliency conferences spirit is stolen historical promise of transformation and fight the book of guarantees mom and have an audience like silly and jewelry that has no no community capital and conformist and transportation of blackness and existing foreclosure possibility of black redemption through the working organization works upon the right board gives the possibility of opposition of black and rights recovery casting the romance of community with its complete and material purity beyond the powers of their police treated as when they can be neighbors of post a bunch of election and the abundances for passionate political subjectivity through the model minority community justifies the possible agency of the slave by affirming in hope, reconciliation, nomination, and other experience of productive politics of agency and choice. The slave is an honorable subject within civil society, which forecloses the position of the slave making violence and influence the harmony and Wilson of no great history and integrated some rights to the subject of the position of the color identity of the intent, the narrative, and deep opportunity for celebration. Unfortunately, social group, which is history, shaped by the new facility, the agency of dominant groups. And result of celebratory narratives of the oppressed there, a space that you can carve out terrorizing the state apparatus and work to exist outside the culture's world, some autonomy of projects and arguments, the notion of virginity and the concepts of the status of the slave position, how we find women and white women different findings this articulate, the notion of consent, opportunity, not accepted for consent, meaningless, and refusal is often considered the figures of contrary notion, subjectivity, pedagogy, on the negation of both of Jenkins has to deny her status as negation of both she can tell a story about sexuality that is meaningful in the white dominant front of this failures, raises a question of whether transgender sexuality is applicable to the conditions that captive community existence and space and application in this captive centrist possibility of action, whether it's in the paradox and agency of who are in fiction representative now, see the space of negation which is black with this and then blackness there's no life there is not no knowledge, just the perception of the huge level of society and with our certain terrain and so sometimes individually, sometimes collectively develop that is the center of the heart of the world, with the cell out of the picture and attaching our resistance movements to dimensions of graphing grassroots organizations, the legal reformist paradigms of marketplace anti-black discriminating the cases Jones 2015. The legal liberal reforms paradigm supports that I don't think in the language of black resistance to racism of the United States will there no other free no best. There is no hashtag for the able traditional slave proposed slave result no tradition of black self-defense begins or defense of the justified the party black liberation black power movements are the 60s suppressing neighborhood rights of civil rights movements of radical limitations that highlighted that the vibrant right traditions recall black masses of Ferguson who settled the slave state cannot create the civil rights from civil rights are as the imaginable right of black liberation, policing, and political liberty orientation, imagination of white bourgeoisie, economic politics, and media, whether they're academic or how they happen to live black chance of black liberation practices found such coordinate in Vietnamese free media and burning plantation, black power, hashtag black lives matter, black persons change, black lives matter, now for the South Carolina, nullifying politics of simulation, tragically important yet to whom the white people never cease to matter ourselves and like people never cease to be important for the right radical slave practices, capitalism is travel and the international war external national enemies assuming that there's a world that it is basically the black lives matter slavery is one head in the sky and hashtag Americanism this is illegal center a lot of social notion of racism cycles classical legal protective posture and go find the richer right makes and the power to pose the question is greater as greatest power of all the only ethical demand is impossible to call to return subjectivity to the slave to return material element to the savages is what you're saying. Black women accused of having been stolen and sober is telling herself it's just later when you're going to turn to you see bringing us on these men sitting on the sidewalk and standing your form the pedestrians where they selectively language the constantly neglecting settle off the settle ball like the ground for the men's wife the actual private firms adequate fairness available modern politics we're watching for narratives to introduce violence separate from modern growth capacity to think that exist spatially and to cause and forget commodity was not safe this pattern she was articulating trying positions to the loss of body dereliction of core political she had the people body the human yet she had subjectivity or something to show for the word she calls it crazy but her both attribute to neighborhood standing return for a lot of the savage free pairs of knowledge to subjectivity at the same two simple sentences to follow royal so simple and structured behind the pragmatic to be dismantled the ethical modernity no longer sound like an oxymoron the right questions of political ontology of people and intellectual mediations and political work sounds completely expert.
First question. Jones' evidence, other than not talking about black matrix, what argument in the 1AC was made that actively precludes that strategy for starting it?
I'm sorry, what did you?
Like, other than like not talking about it, what argument in the 1AC was detrimental to the black matrix?
That's the argument that you need to start with, I guess, the figure of the black woman understanding like black reproductivity in order to, I guess, get your role of the ballot, which you say is to liberate black lives and disrupt that criminalization. Criminalization of black women stems from the site of the womb, so you don't get access to that.
Okay.
When you
Yeah, I think this is important. It's not whether or not the 1AC has precluded it, it's whether or not the 1AC structural analysis of anti-blackness is one that is sufficient to resolve or even educate properly about the interworkings of anti-blackness. We think that your analysis of the myth of minority has foreclosed a possibility of understanding the way that black reproductivity in particular sutures the underlying political structure of the country.
Next question, second one to star evidence. It's in the context criticizing transphobic conversations that this person overheard at activist rallies. What part of the 1AC was a transphobic conversation?
No, that part is talking about like the Black Lives Matter movement, which you kind of continue in your 1AC. Yeah. It talks about how those movements are transphobic because every time those women, trans women were murdered, there were never rallies around those bodies. It was always ignored. The 1AC furthers that silence.
All right. Next question, Sexton Lake. It's a critique of immigrant rights and conservative colorblindness. Again, what's the link to the 1AC?
Well, no, sure. Sexton evidence is an indictment here of 1AC's idea of multiracial coalitions. He indicates that multiracial coalitions that begin from the standpoint of a paradigm shift, i.e. a Jung evidence, which is a shift in power relations, is one that is necessarily problematic, given that it is only capable of reifying the myth of the minority as a political conflict versus actually attending to the structural antagonism, which at its fundamental core is black.
Okay. Next question, Carmen Wilderson, like, the argument is that there is a difference between the positionality of black women and white women. What's the link? Like, you tag it as Asian women, or no, some of the tags are, but like this evidence is not saying Asian women.
Our Hartman and Wilderson evidence is indicting the idea of reclamations of subjectivity, which is what the myth of the minority movement is about, which is what all of the Jung evidence is about, especially the courses that you don't cut. He gives the example of a distinction between black and white women to outline the idea of notions of consent, but the card is in the context of attempts to reclaim political agency and political subjectivity and the ability to make demands on political institutions.
Thank you. Just a quick clarification question on the alternative. Do you defend like giving back the land and return?
Well, we defend the impossibility of posing the question of whether or not it is effective.
So it's an alternative to ask the question.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
But the power to pose an impossible question. We like to ask the question. But honestly, ask the question.
Top prep, we're at 328. Used. So we have 632 left.
Actually, please say it fast.
Right.
No.
13 weeks.
Orders you can face it over here and then K. For the first row.
It's 6 claims in month.
Who's kick?
Case
Case kick.
Where was it?
He's trying to steal all my pens.
Extend our rolling balance to the rolling balance of over team who best disrupts the criminalization of the black body. Our advocacy is the refusal for Asian Americans to continue to be used as tools of white supremacy and to switch sides from the white side of the binary to the black side of the binary, to take away power from white supremacy and to refuse to continue to be cited as reasons that racism doesn't exist. And we say that we confront the CIA and the state in their part in racist covert actions like the Dark Alliance, for building the Golden Triangle and constructing the Mall minority to reveal the complicity of the state in this crime. And third, we recognize that anti-blackness is the fulcrum of all white supremacy, and our advocacy is to create a united front to oppose it. And the only alternative to our advocacy is allowing the violence and oppression to continue. It's time to wage an Asian American war on white supremacy, raising our voices in public spaces such as debate our key covert team. Asian Americans were anonymous, going to refuse to police officers when they were black men on the SWAT team. We could talk to them about during the meeting. They agreed that clearly was a misdemeanor execution. Please clearly handle them Asian Americans. Some history of racial discrimination, but the same need to get our allies, Americans, small minority, it's false talking us to Americans and other violent location workers, Asian Americans, and police, because of the small minority, because of the century long epidemic when it comes to of death, at least Asian Americans participated in civil rights 40 years ago. Getting the defense by being good allies, being good people, confident, stealing, and all being not facing threat, using these arguments to excuse aggressive and white racism, and really digital complicity, white supremacy, fundamentally corrupt relations with ourselves, Asian Americans, join together, collectively, with races, public spaces. If there was supremacy, wrong, participate in any white supremacy structure. Asian Americans up in the in many circumstances, but also kids kills black, Latino, Native people, benefit of slavery, polio, and genocide institutions run on the principles. Asian Americans pay taxes, support massive incarceration, and work on business, living white supremacy is dominant over operating racial from fed oppressive white supremacy structure of the label. Many of us participate in retreat, collecting social and economic capital, will push back against system, makes it complicit in racist murder, suppression of black, Latino, Native people, black and black, trans women, men, and non-binary people face daily sexual outside of violence. Hits the state actors start living as allies to the arms and allies and disease. While you're fighting worthwhile use of allies, because it makes it in front of being an ally. I will come to white supremacy, small stop from Asian American war, which supremacy needs to leave of the American dream. On this way of benefit, pushing ourselves against white supremacy, being way to reduce all daily struggles and to find every part of our lives and place activism as battlefields, serving against white supremacy, against anti-black racism, and native immigration, which all white supremacy is about. We don't need white supremacy on our success ways and not proceed because let's supremacy slide. And
the first thing that they read is only a link of omission that we don't include Black women in our analysis. But if the minority mutiny means a mutiny of all kinds for an analysis of how oppression fits into anti-Black oppression, that means we advocate for an analysis of why this exists in the absence of other oppressions that are not existing in the current movement. Just because I began with my personal subjectivity doesn't mean that our methodology does not advocate for the presence of Black women in the movement. There is no foreclosure. It's left as an open question of how we can analyze how the state has done crimes such as the Dark Alliance and the Golden Triangle, and how we can be able to push back on racist covert actions such as this. And they say that we are only a continuation of the Black Lives Matter movement, and this leads to trans silence. But if we are a analysis of what the Black Lives Matter movement is currently missing, and trying to analyze how we can fit Asian American experience into this, and we're going to link to this argument. We are rejecting the idea of Asian Americans in specific making that the idea that they are supposed to be docile and submissive and not making a fuss, and this rejection of docility and silence means that we would advocate for the greater participation of trans bodies in the movement. And Junk 14 specifically talks about the inclusion and importance of trans women in the conversation about how the minority has been constructed by white male domination, and how we can fit it into the movement for change. And they also say that the minority community is reminiscent of a post-civil rights era, and if this card talks about liberal reform, we're also going to link to this argument. We make an analysis of the structural antagonisms that exist, starting with how the CIA has smuggled cocaine into Black neighborhoods to begin the war on drugs. This is a structural analysis of how they have further criminalized Blackfish in the American psyche. This is our Alexander 10 evidence that talks about how Blackness is an ontological position, and this analysis means that we meet this argument with our the analysis of structural antagonisms is at the forefront of our advocacy. And also we are a rejection of civil society. This part, the tag of this card talks about how this is only a movement to further assimilate Asian Americans into civil society. We are in opposition of obscuring the existence of other oppressions within this framework of white supremacy. It's not simply a liberal glossing over the black-white binary. We realize that the black-white binary is the structuring of how the world is today, and instead of taking this out and trying to take a contingent multicultural approach, we instead saying that we will no longer refuse to be white side of the binary, but instead align on the black side of the binary. And they say that we are only affirming hope and treating the slave as an honorable subject. With the third link, this is the Hartman card. First of all, this card talks about how there's differences between white women and Black women, which means there's no link, and also they're not a celebratory narrative. We are a recognition of how the world is anti-Black. We talk about how things like the mass incarceration leads to prison industrial complex, and the war on drugs. This is a recognition of first how anti-Black the world is, so that we can have the possibility for resisting this and change. And the Mall minority, they read this argument about how we are only a grassroots organization. This card talks about movements like the Black Panthers and the Black Liberation Army, and say how these are the models that we should be using. But the Mala minority myth was created to suppress these revolts. Mala minority myth started in a New York Times article in the midst of the Black liberation movement, and this was created by white supremacy to suppress the same movements that they're saying that we should be moving. So we must first challenge the Mala minority myth before we can engage in this sort of a good revolt that they're talking about. We are a prerequisite to be able to move towards this, rather than the what they call hashtagging movements of today. The app is in a replication of these grassroots movements. We are starting with an analysis of how other oppressions can fit within this and start a greater united front by taking away the tools that white supremacy has used to white supremacy in the state has used to subjugate colored bodies. And on the alternative, we are a prerequisite alternative to first ask this question of whether Turtle Island can be given back to the natives. It begins with analyzing how white supremacy operates and be able to challenge the same system that brought us in the first place. We are an analysis of colonialism. This is our McCoy evidence that talks about the Golden Triangle, how CIA brought about the Golden Triangle in Southeast Asia to be able to replicate federal colonialism. And so this structural analysis of how it's happened historically and still continuing today, and providing a methodology to be able to resist this, means that we are prerequisite to this question. And also we are not mutually exclusive. There's probably a reason for the permutation. Also, the disadvantage to alternative alone is because it does not solve for the existence of the Mala minority. It doesn't solve for how Asian Americans are seen as a docile, submissive subject. Only the permutation can access both of these. Also permutation to the app. I did a pretty good work on the links and talked about how we actually are our advocacy, our methodologies, call for inclusion of what they flagged as the missing groups in the current Black Lives Matter movement. It isn't some type of liberal reform that relies on multicultural coalitions or that begs for Asian Americans to be included in civil society. It's a rejection of it. And we include a specific analysis of the model minority myth that's contributed to create the image of the unspoken passive Asian American woman, naturalizing sexual violence in the Asian feminine body, Asian Pacific women are being racially, sexually harassed, specific and sexual, racial fear by some racial gender stereotypes, and model minority myth listening for super successful theories relates to Asian Pacific American women has to be submissive and anticipating gender through the sophistry of obedience to violation Asian Pacific women, popular culture compliant, Asian from nature feels harassed to release a Pacific woman views such as not by back, objectification is a material evaluation of contributions based on accomplishments and perceptions of potentially harass Asian Pacific women with greater harassment due to racial interceptions, exotic psychotic masochistic desires of sexual domination, some ideal typical gratifiers of Western neo-colonial formation, colonial military domination, anti-woman sexual domination, provide ultimate Western methodology, the objective of gender stereotypes, Asian Pacific women, discipline women, just like Asian Pacific Americans use things in nominal context, the ultimate wellness of fantasy product of colonial sexual mythology based on Western acceptance, Susie Wong's original modern fantasy, Asian Pacific American woman is subsequent university despicable, cultivated image and light, gentle, environment, not tolerant, undistinguished from other hostile environments, and Asian American women suffer the sexual and second injury through the second standard of sexuality, where further identity, Asian American women are seen as sexual commodities that constrains her from both representations of her body and sexuality. 297. Stereotypes which is recognize the difference between stories of model minority stereotype concepts held existing disagrees, traditional gender stereotype, information descriptions, active gender rebalance, power relations, gender stereotypes, racial media, Asian Pacific women, treat down sexuality, gets toxic, having secretly large well knowing power relations, active toxic, Singapore gaining equal to visit, don't agree Singapore, all that functions of the derived from relationship, community time, credentials, and favorite status in the department of willing to engage situations with chair and exchange for economic function made frequently consulting outside of depicting making popular part with a common current chair and okay, perm the alternative. There's no mutually exclusive parts of our affirmative and the alternative. In fact, we are a prerequisite to posing the question of whether Turtle Island should be returned to the natives. White supremacy must be challenged in ways.
Okay, what are all the terms?
Sorry, my one.
What's that context?
Yes. The perms are perm do both, perm do the af, and perm do the alternative.
How does perm do the af function?
How does perm? Well, we would say that in our the model minority mutiny, it already includes the question of how we relate to the land. Our young evidence talks about how, or the co-evidence I read in the 2AC talks about how Asian Americans have benefited from white supremacy, and it specifically talks about how we are living on stolen land from the natives.
I get that. How does that solve your role with that one?
How does that solve our role?
Actually, not the role with that one. How does that solve the criticism?
How does that solve the criticism? Well, we say that it includes all the groups all the parts that you said were missing from the affirmative. It was more like a re-articulation that yes, this is included. And second, we say that resolves the alternative itself because the question can be posed with the methodology of the affirmative.
That was like really surfacey. Could you go into that?
Yeah. Can you explain what you're confused about?
Like you said. Can you tell me how the 1AC includes, I guess, an analysis of how Black women operate within the realm of anti-Blackness?
Okay, well, we would say that in our analysis of how there are important missing parts in the current way
what are these important missing parts? Because you're being very, very generic.
What are these important missing parts? The inclusion of non-cis women mostly. We talk about Sikhs and Muslims and within Asian Americans.
Where do you get that analysis? Because it seems that you are only talking about the docility and passivity of Asian American women.
Well, if your rejection
that
of
Black women fit into that stereotype.
Well, if your rejection of the scripts that are imposed by the same white structures that created the model minority.
Okay, how are you an analysis of those scripts onto Black women?
If we are critiquing the very structure that creates those same scripts, then if we were critiquing that period.
I think
so. Black power movements who rallied around white supremacy, but also rape Black women. Is that?
Okay. First of all, that's not us. Second of all, she read a piece of Suez show.
I get that, but I'm saying my argument is that rallying around a structure doesn't mean that you include those people. So I'm asking you, what specifically is your analysis of?
So the Tracy piece of show evidence that Aaron read in her speech.
The show evidence is about the docility and the sexuality of Asian American women.
Yes, I mean, it is also a begs a broader
How
question
does
of.
that, what does that have
I
to do
cannot
with?
get the sentence after this.
No,
It does not, like, it begs a broader question of racial and sexual, racialized gender stereotype, which we would argue is like a key part of the analysis of how like racism, sexuality.
And how settler colonialism plays in.
That's cool.
Sorry?
Okay, let's set a random session. One card on the paper, that's it. Y'all put it around this,
Why did you even run? It was like walking speed.
Right. That's why I just really cool.
He's gonna run, guys. That's the right shit. That's the right.
I don't think I even got it.
No?
I didn't just put it, yeah.
I'm just getting the job.
Okay, love making him angry every year. Fix it. Oh, I did not do it.
The other is just the criticism. There's going to be a short opening and then the perms are going to be at the top. Probably need a lot of space for the perm. The one they see for closing analysis, structure, anti-black, the researcher, civil society, the only ethics of the debate is the power to posing possible questions of turning around to the subject of activities like money, action taken civil society, particularly as possible purpose that there was a reformable action on the structure, liberty, the position of the human recurrent impact of society, only alternative to integrate the call, to slave the call, of the shaft to the ethical frame to properly analyze and grab itself without reintegrating the girls back into the limited perception of the human. Now, ow, to the permanent hit, they don't get a purpose about the method to make day. The makes someone they see not touchable, creates better teaching for them because it makes been a big part of education because they were always like out of what's the one they see me indicates that method is key to test the nuances between scholarship, which is a better form of productive thinking, given that this, given that they don't tie themselves to an inherent plan text trees that this is about form they know all three parts attach themselves to institutional value making black and Asian people fungible resources to impact trusting firms because they're always reified the amount of my notes because the society will always find new ways to use the Asian body to exploit the path of anti-black purposes, which is independent reach to reject affirmative absent the criticism and shape to allow institutional purpose to create our own destructive life liberty when we identify our test. The right to come to human as motion to make us human no right to institution and policy in the sense to be consistent only a perpetuating and such entity you make some values for the resource for the have institutions once we have identified ourselves any purpose beyond ourselves we can become a who most is to our to attach us to external values separate us from the instance of our focus on instance being now digitally heard to the alternative someone to have to the advocacy of the one is that we are impact turning the focus on the one is not starting with the potentiality of posing a problem question of whether or not sensitivity should be returned to the same whether or not turn or all should return to the established crazy problematic form of debate. This turns to the affirmative education claims given that increase the justification for the affirmative become a movement target was taking care now parts of the answer, but not parts, but the entirety of the fucking affirmative, which makes the one see move point also this makes it impossible to test the affirmative to vote fairness out there. There's also no net benefits any of the permutations articulated out in choosing between you to be very skeptical language. The only potential one is the amount of minority arguments which we are impacted. Now, all the links are also disadded to perfectly affirmative. I will do the link debate here. The first is subjectivity disadded. One is his affirmation of minority media in terms of research and political subjectivity was just about the impossibility of agency for the slave and the savage. I will say, and part of evidence indicates that the inclination is rhetoric of the left attempts to take narratives of political disenfranchisement, i.e., the minority and create the political basis for celebration of the possibility of reform, i.e., in that quote from there, John evidence that they don't copy off about the minority as hope to transform U.S. political, economic, and cultural systems to value humanity over capital, generation of war, which is there. One is piece of junk evidence versus starting the position of absolute in the real symbolic election. What is in the Harvard indicates that this alternative location of agency that attempts to carve out spaces of freedom and recent resistance of the terrorized state apparatus in order to transform civil society to value autonomy, humanity, which do impacts the turning affirmative. The first is the negation of blacks in order to resituate modern agency that it is in its very essence purifies the structure of colonial humanism, which turns to affirmative given that the blacks are denied the very humanism, the one they see attempts to have political structures value. The second is it requires a forced telling of black and Asian stories that require disavow of her status as as her status of black nation so that she can tell a story about sexuality and racism that is meaningful and white dominated colonial flame, which leads to the negation of her will, which turns to affirmative, particularly it was also particularly answers to two pieces of child evidence about Asian Americans and women that they read the criticism, which is also independent link to the criticism given that it's tips of fall female slave girls suffering into Asian oppression, which is all is a show evidence. Also, the last piece of White Kim evidence, which can only ever structurally justice slave focusing precludes the possibility of alternative. The second big argument that is also a disadvantage to all the permutations in this multi-racial coalition. They are not doing the proper analysis for sex and evidence in any case that the attempt to form multi-racial coalition that given the standpoint of a paradigm shift is merely anti-racialist right and submit no matter what minority comes to represent a political conflict, i.e. political men that can be satisfied the best versions of the one they see is outlined by the portion of the junk evidence that they also don't use, which indicates that the type of and I quote grassroots organization and networks organizing on the ground in Asian American communities required will be the Southeast Asian Freedom Network, which as of June 17th on their Facebook page are negotiating and making demands on the United Nations and the Human Rights Network to review and take action to have the Cambodian government improve the civil rights of Cambodian citizens to achieve the level of capacity of human agency autonomy to make demands on political institutions, which research structural anti-blackness turning case our sex and evidence also indicates that the ability to perform a mutiny, to organize a sense of coherent, complete community in which coherent, coherent, transferable political demands can be made, which is disarticulated at the level of the slave in which black redemption is foreclosed, particularly in the context of organizing in which Ferguson becomes a pretty good goddamn example, which fractures the purpose obviously given that sexist has started our politics from a romanticization of community radically wars against the possibility of and oppositional blacks that a third like argument that is also a disadvantage to the permutation of independent unity of disadvantage to the act is the consciousness raising there. When they see junk evidence indicates that the model minority community attempts to acquire more knowledge that they can use to determine political grassroots action, which just reifies the political structure of humanism, turning cases in theory into models of mirror gravitational models focus on the as this ideology critique focuses on what might be conformity and the correspondence speak back and do the backdoor of the subject forms the dialectical modes that simply mirrors objects and divides the system mediation reproduces the system. It's about the subject must be trained to truly express the system and unbelievable by reproducing this is the role of critiquing its conformity correspondence between the subject and the system of power that reproduces the potential for change conscious critique seems an unloaded weapon in the face of relentless acting out of power conformity at a precarious level of habit is the only conscious force. The only conscious force is strong enough to counter those powers of self-interest and lies. The subject all the more affirming into position doesn't make a true choice depending on the identification and faithfully based on others as a sovereign individual who usually sharing thoughts and experience that our argument is that the way that structural anti-black resources want to see a true but they claim to how anti-blackness is able to use the myth of the minority to then oppress black bodies for a civil society which is code and consume the one political project making Asian Americans who are conscious of anti-blackness the new form of our minority, which impact turns to confirm that given that we can only start from the level of theorizing and end to the world as we know versus transferable action within civil society is not burning and three anti-racist organizations founded by white supremacy. There's no such thing as anti-racist in the same bodies that were able to be racialized twice that were able to view as rational, authoritarian, and deserving continued activists are stopped by police who will not be viewed as inherently criminal suspects. She continues anti-racism. Makes white people those valuable people, non-white people are forced to feel dependent and grateful on white people who interact with us. We are to feel capable of white activists reproducing the actual structure of white supremacy in the pictures on the lives of non-white activists who do not interact with you and activist roles. The alternative is the power to pose the question, is the ability to pose the impossible question of whether or not the subjectivity can be returned to the same, whether or not the term out can be returned to the savage. Our roots and evidence indicates that the positionality of the black subject gestures towards a disconfiguration of civil society from the coherence of civil society. The black subject beckons with the incoherence of like civil war, which is also the top part of the one to see a war that reclaims black is not as a positive value, but as a politically let's say our black bullets and evidence indicates that this is able to repair the demolished subjectivity of the slave to simple to intervene into the dominant antagonism of civil society that the dominant antagonism of civil society that verifies and structurally adjusts black savage in the aging. Now her argument is that they are structural analysis because they analyze the CIA drug trafficking, but this web evidence is about a CIA is a recognition of a contingent conflict which is proven to through historical shifting of things like crack to marijuana, which is not a structural analysis of conflictual contingent analysis of war drugs. They're not a critique of the larger structural paradigm of criminality, anti-blackness, which it's only done through the, which is only done through the alternative, which is only done through the alternative. When I see instead for folks that possibly do their analysis of the analysis of the CIA intervention in the war on drugs, particularly in the context of the opium drug movement, which they will never be able to effectively get at the level of the alternative, which is that only the alternative cannot resolve the impacts of the criticism, also the impacts of the case debate, given that the power to pose the question allows us to fundamentally and pedagogically rethink the way that we engage in pragmatic political resistance, which means that the alternative is the prerequisite to any type of mass mobilization that would probably never even occur anyway in the world of the affirmative, which means that you can only go negative.
So this piece of Malcolm evidence you read talks about how there's no such thing as a white anti-racist, and it's also written by an Asian woman. How does our advocacy, like I guess, fall in the category of like white anti-racism, like white activist movements?
Well, the evidence is particularly used to describe the inherent structure of anti-blackness and white supremacy. What Knopper is indicating is that given the way that white supremacy and anti-blackness operate as a paradigmatic structural impossibility of civil society, she indicates that there is no potentiality for things like a resuturing or a reification or a transformation of things like civil society. So her argument is that in the context of white people are incapable of being anti-racist because of the larger structural paradigm.
Okay.
That is applicable to the affirmative, given that Asian Americans are never able to fully overcome the myth about a minority simply by transforming or reforming civil society. For instance, I give the example that the way that civil society will use your app in the real world is that the model minority or the Asian body who becomes conscious of anti-blackness becomes the new model minority.
All right, okay, so I have a question about that actually. So what is the alternative to becoming conscious about anti-blackness? What can Asian Americans do? Are we supposed to remain a neutral subject that's like just takes what is occurring?
Well, in the context of this debate, we think that it would have been a better question of posing whether or not it is capable or possible to return subjectivity to the slave. Our argument is that this is a fundamental shift in the way that we produce pedagogies about the way that we teach grassroots organization in the real world, because our
But doesn't that still meet the fitting? Doesn't that still fit the idea of an Asian that is aware of anti-blackness, thus being the same like model minority? I think that.
No, I don't think so.
But why not?
Because
Isn't that an awareness?
Minority mutiny, as per your Jung evidence, starts from the premise that we can become informed Asian citizens about anti-blackness and then take grassroots.
All right, I have another question.
To transform the political, economic, and social lives of Black people. Our argument is that we should not start our politics in a place of transforming, but a place of absolute destruction.
So in context, when I answered that, we don't defend the state or any reformism.
Yes, but that's not what your Jung
so it doesn't matter. So it's what Jung says. It doesn't matter what we are advocating in this debate round.
Okay, first off, you as a person is not disconnected from your wanting to see sovereignty advocate. No.
We cannot advocate portions. So do you agree with Wilderson's argument that Asians are only junior partners in the struggle for liberation?
I mean, I don't know what that would get you, sure.
So
I still think that we should start the fundamental thesis of our political engagement from the impossibility of what can occur in civil society versus a pragmatic, contingent, conflictual form of political solution.
Also, when you talk, can you explain your force-telling argument to me?
Force-telling?
Force telling.
That's part of the Wilderson evidence. So the portion that you talked about in terms of the distinction between Black and white women, he indicates that Celia and Jones were forced to tell their story about sexuality and sexual exploitation in a way that was able to be coherent to political institutions and political structures, which just works to impact your child evidence when you indicate that Asian women need to come forth about the sexual type of exploitation, which becomes a new way in which civil society uses the Asian American identity to oppress particularly Black women. The Troy will talk to you about that. Yeah, absolutely.
Is this pep right now?
No, it's
No,
not.
okay. not paying attention. That was not cool. Did I?
Wait,
That's
did.
it. No, it's not. Second part. So quick. Yeah, we're good. What's on here?
Black Matrix. The docility and passivity of Asian women is not inclusive of Black women's experience, which doesn't disrupt the criminalization of Black bodies because the root of Black bodies criminalization or Black women's criminalization is from the womb. The site of reproduction of the Black woman is the site of death, focusing on Asian violence, even when it's tied to anti-Blackness. Anti-Black violence reproduces anti-Blackness by a facing the singularity of anti-Blackness and Oriental liberation politics towards upward mobility and recognition. Scenario 15, the speed and actions of response to Patel's case, Mr. Patel's life, and Black race abuse had with the responses to systematic large cultural attitude pertaining to the larger South Asian community causes them to make easy scapegoats to lower class and desire class mobility, shoring up the status quo, presence as American driven death and naturally collude class interests, U.S. interests, and war, that they grew up with capitalism and lives of poorest Americans and the many color suffering some other groups, even the most progressive, talented, and even the outrage whose police were repressing progressive fields and not long-term systems of pressure they collectively find with hotel was guilty of one of the social crimes about the innocent somehow said the sad count of the nation of the immigrants when in fact the country has been built by genocide and slave labor. Case of violence withheld need to focus on the prevailing cities and Black culture that set forth that doesn't manifest itself in physical violence and identified as Black violence and exclusion practices of immigrants, which is biggest fear that might be identified as back, which means that they don't get access to their role in valid when you see the one theorizations of Blackness seem to begin with the Black matrix in order to understand the contours of anti-Blackness, Black reproductivity. Black reproductivity is the site for both the symbolic and material subjugation of Black women's experience of races, the gender balance and folding us back into the marginalization, but also the attempt to fold our experiences into Asian women Americans' experience, which means that they were closed house sexuality laid the foundation for Black women's relationship to violence through chattel slavery. They were reduced to the object who can reproduce the object. This is how anti-Blackness affects Black women. Which means that the model minority is not able to solve her criminalization after realism is the better alternative because it calls for a greater scrutiny to the assault against Black reproductivity and under-theorized feature of Black activity by confronting the theoretical limitations of political practices and conceptualizing freedom. The next step is that the one you see excludes trans women by furthering a movement that is silent on this, following back to Black trans women as face harsher levels of anti-Blackness because of internalized transphobia and heteronormativity. Without an active focus on this, they cannot disrupt their criminalization, but they also only can replicate anti-Blackness and heteronormativity within these movements because they are transphobic. You only push them to the back, which impact turns their role of the valley because they enable oppression and the criminalization by silence trans people. This Elliot and taking the diversity of trans lives into account this theory to the development of inclusive feminist theories and practices on ongoing violence against women, trans persons, including not limited internationally publicized murders of women and teen and John had urgent the public awareness to alleviate trans people and groups to trans life both inside and outside the queer communities enables a host of repressive practices to persist, from differential access to hormones and surgery, healthcare to criminalization, transsexual lives are ordered and governed by and controlled through the criminalization of prostitution and poverty and the illness and discrimination attended on their low socioeconomic backgrounds, but also as sex workers in which the works in the majority experience of obstacles are known as enacted critically rethinking assumptions that underlie the gender difference marginalization of trans persons, the fact that transsexual are right represented and unright and soul food theory represent and official starting over beyond gender theory have critical engagement with trans issues about co-cares about social justice to clearly warn. And the next step is the Jones evidence, which indicates that these legal liberal performance paradigms are just like the civil rights movements, which foreclose black radical movements because it perpetuated the settler state's agenda that pacified radical resistance. The one you see is just that, because it extends to Black Lives Matter movement, which is a self-nullifying politics assimilation, because it refused to radically challenge anti-blackness and white supremacy, because it is focused on recentering the settler sociological notion of racism by perpetuating the classical respectable Negro who is engaged within the movements within these movements. Our Jones evidence indicates that there are no hashtags or mobilizations around slave revolts or around Black Panther movements or the Black Liberation Army who actively use counter-violence to revolt against anti-blackness, to resist these types of paradigms. If they oppose those types of movements, that means that they can only fold themselves back into the legal liberal performance paradigm that is used and controlled by the state to pacify resistance, to keep anti-blackness as the main structure in place, which means that they only replicate the model minority.
Running pro.
Yes.
Thank you.
All right, stop prep. 324. No cards.
Yeah, go to the pool.
Wait, can you put-
Money up. 327 is total. It'll be the criticism flow, going straight down pretty much, starting with the permutation, theory of it, and then going down the lengths. Well, yeah, well, sorry, case, and then critique. Conceptualize differently.
That got confusing. What was the order?
Case, and then pretty much block order of the 2NC.
Okay.
Anyone not ready?
Wait, I don't have.
There is no one there.
What?
No one there.
Can you save it?
You don't need to do that.
No,
Ready?
Welcome to the model minority immunity, the role of balance to vote for whoever best ideologically and argumentatively disrupts the criminalization of black body voting after challenges the anti-black violence drug war in 3 ways. First, reveals the CIA conspiracies against black bodies via funneling crack from South American street gangs, facilitating heroin production in Southeast Asia to go fund counterinsurgency. That's weapon of equivalence to understand from society being structured through the black body paradigm. Nakagawa says if the broker white supremacy price contemporary politics, obviously because of the way that the American community works by constructing criminal black, all others are black and inserted from Asian Americans interrogating the ontological position of the white side of the minority, declare solidarity with those who have been placed in the black side. That young 14 evidence says this starts with certainty with Trump's correlation to our broader political movement now. The critical critique.
Or actually, stand there, sorry.
Several choices called it the absent importance that they fight in the fight against white supremacy includes the discussion of how racial stereotypes, including black and brown women, have been criminalized, hypersexualized, and in contrast to the docile, submissive women, which means we have a Christmas back all the black matrix 2016, which next began new arguments, and also there's a question of give back light to the certain source of all kinds of the evidence. Now let's go to the critique, but yes, we can appreciate fair interpretation to the question of competition. The biggest way they're going to win is one of the missions we should avoid from the one reason that says an arbitrary standard who may begin only 9 minutes to 1 AC, which means the link is an L, which gives a fraction just that's their interpretation. They kill coalition because they will disavow any movement that will didn't talk about what they want to talk about and say exactly they wanted it to. This is unique to the captions of the unique to sway from the Asian briefly mold the model minority in order to stop being a tool of white supremacy, which they we'll get to more later. Now we have the information to that benefit. I'll get rather negative information. I'll get to that later. They say that for education. No, it's very good for education. First of all, you read mostly links out full effort, which is probably means we don't need to win this argument teamwork to win the affirmative. Also, there are nuanced arguments arbitrary considering especially since our authors are setting to their IURS with each other in society. Just like nuances are not to say that also the you did not hear that the block answer the Nakagawa evidence, which gives our point of certain points or structural analysis. You should predict pretty skeptical when they say we're not structural analysis. They permutation that's a shape evidence. The shape evidence is actually a very libertarian hack, and I knew because my old party used to read that card. Correct, pretty bad. If that part author's right, then we were all pretty much wrong in its paper on Janine should stand it because the biocontext article is right-wing hackery, not relevant to this debate. And if next one is the permutation, we're going to go for permutation. We're not going for any other permutation means that you have to answer theory and not the permutation is also not permutation because we'll say we're structural analysis, which is the perpetually affirmative. Now, the first thing we're going to link to all of their arguments first is subjectivity. Like yes, the agents have subjectivity. We should reject that. They should reject that subjectivity and align itself with the black body. It's a question of using your privilege to do something that isn't completely bad for everyone else. But our Williston argument in red, white, and black is to dance with death. And the problem with politicalism is that they never dance with death, which means aligning on the black side of the binary is the dance with death that Williston calls for, which means we're winning a internal link to all their alternative solving services. They saw the case, and we saw that too. Next argument, the force telling argument is relevant, unknowing that argument reveal her sexuality as named woman as she chose to be argument to appear relevant, same full sexualities, no lengthy shortenances, links to broader questions of racialized and sexual stereotypes in the racial society, which means there's no homogenized connection to coalition thing. Also, your sex and evidence is pretty generic, which says that we should have a social analysis that was about this lack of dominance, which you learned from this argument. Next argument is that this is not because of model minority immunity. His argument is sex numbers that multiple coded with conservative awareness and multiracial coalitions are bad, but argument is that it gives uniquely the context of Asian Americans who align themselves with this the binary. Next argument is they say coalitions bad, but this contradicts evidence of BLA and Black Panther Party. Say it's good, we'll get to that more later. Now the conscious rating of the link is pretty embarrassing argument. It makes zero sense. It's all the conscious rating. When people learn something, it is something to be avoided. It's a foreign conscious rating, or it's a semantic distinction. It's not really like also qualifications, inevitable conscious rating, so that the anti-racist is racist. And the status argument goes after Aaron's when it comes to circle in, says that the argument is that there is no such thing as a white anti-racist. Neither was a white, but there is a Jewish scripting Aaron as what was exactly the argument every time some side shows to script Aaron as the white bodies and can't do the fair and pull her back to the white side matter, which is the reason of your piece of young evidence that historically the model minority myth was used to suppress black political movements and black rage, which is the reason that the affirmative is good because it allows the black movements to be self-discriminating. At least we're not a robot. Robots are now say that CIA's analysis is continued to know this one person CIA is the constant one which is the borrow concept of structural antagonism. That's the Alexander evidence indicates that it is the latest wave of commercialization of black folks, which all Alexander with evidence which means we are structural as possible. We are structural now that there are next time alternative debate. They say pedagogical changes to prevent arbitrarily that doesn't cost money analysis blah but listen, we don't give back putting anything, give back the land, give back to who, what happens to black people if we give back the land. These are fundamental questions that you should answer the consequences. Otherwise we're going to get to nowhere. Also we have this after alternative because it silences the voices of Asian Americans. Either it does silence Asian Americans and the impacts of 1AC is just out to the alternative, or it is not included in permutation to solve all this question. Next, arguments about some of the black women, I guess that about that comment being their evidence on the full 2 votes for their evidence. Is that first the reason that Patel got a faster response to sexuality because he not a minority because they saw him as why they tried to skip him back, which means the affirmative that this is the affirmative is fundamentally true, which is the Lynching argument. Also, next, or is that the evidence claims that all immigrants are here to upper class mobility, which is the same attempt of trying to script immigrant bodies into the whites of the paradigm, which is uniquely devastating considering the kind of drug evidence analysis of 11 especially by black people. Next argument is that the consider black to translate. Listen, Starbucks is bad. It's criticizing transphobic conversations in the Black Lives Matter movements. We say we are key to black self-determination movements. That's fine. No link there. If anything, our evidence brings discussion of black, trans, and non-cisgendered women, which means we're letting this argument. And also the Jones link is also terrible. It says that you can't hold yourself for every bad person, rebel in the black resistance movement. We say that we were key to suppress Black Panther, which is something their evidence is a good thing, which means the act is fundamentally good. We're lynching all the respectability arguments. That's exactly what minority myth says.
Two questions. Your name is Aaron, right?
Yes.
And what firm did you go for?
Developers.
There's no one.
Yes. Just like flush out the. No, that's it.
Okay. The order is the criticism of the overview, and the things that I did, and then the presentation.
one of the sides.
He's obsessed with this seated selfness or seated thing. Okay. So,
One of these minority media is only capable of foreclosing structure without suspecting black as they are seen. They are considered by unique this question that controls the direction of the league. The impact of any action taken in civil society that attempts to transform or shift power relations, which is the one I see. Junk evidence have political structures value. Our humanity is the life, the logical life performance of that structure. We reinforce the position of colonial human. This which is the root cause of society impact because it falls asleep and starts to grab us up against a coherent narrative of pain that was structurally unjust and experience that I can see well, one of these will settle is the only as a demand is the power to pose the question of the impossible question, which is the precondition to not only rise to the condition, but also not to the condition which is to concede a prerequisite argument out of one of y'all now. The part of the here, they do not get a permutation to meant to be like this. Makes a permutation making a affirmative or not. To test whether or not the affirmative is a good idea because it forecloses the possibility to the test of nuances of the want to see strategic, but choice the want to see strategic political option, which is problematic for education, but also for the false form of the national self-structure anti-black. He says the perm, he says the structure of this advantage you have not been but you also have infinite prep to be able to defend what you did and did not say, which is uniquely key to negative ground, give that and also despite our one team language means the one seems also leads me to the permutation of separate because they have to foreclose the ability to call the one is the starting point of the minority out of order for the permutation of function, which is the voting fairness and the case because it makes one team future talk moving target with the possibility for resolving anti-structure, anti-blackness, other type of shiftiness is also a logic of the anti-blackness that allows them to script them out of minority to be used to be facilitators of anti-blackness for facilitators of anti-blackness to cause one of the impacts on the Schaefer evidence is actually really good. You should have answered it instead of a shitty joke argument. Now Schaefer evidence indicates that attaching itself to the institutional logic of the debate through the historical colonization method of the permutation attached to one to violate institutional purposes that allows them to recreate the myth of the minority to allow everybody to be used as a bunch of resources to implement to be having institutional further structural positions of anti-blackness, which also turns the affirmative outside the criticism, which means that the affirmative will never be able to resolve the alternative debate, but actually causes the impact of structure anti-blackness. They also see that there's no motherfucking that benefit to the permutation, and the only one that they could possibly have is the myth of the minority, which is the impact about a link debate, which I will do here. Our first piece to consider James evidence indicates that the black matrix is the best starting point for resolving structural position of anti-blackness, because we need to start from the question of black reproductivity in order to understand how civil society replicates itself, i.e. black women who birth come out and increase the condition for slave labor for the minority to be even being utilized and mobilized against blacks in the first place, which means that this is not a linkable mission but a link of the commission that outweighs the affirmative, because without second recognition, our James evidence says it has to pass the first that it folds black women back into a male member of stuff not even want to see and focus on the larger structural criminality in the prison industrial complex, which our James evidence indicates is the structural unique position of the male grammar stuff, which forecloses an analysis of when the black women are structured in the larger paradigm of anti-blackness, but it also folds black women back into the Asian experience, i.e. the Cho evidence about the Asian American passivity, which Aaron in the cross-section of the tweets he's taking the universalized, which he raises the structural position of black women that's not passive but as aggressive and deviant and hypermasculine, which fractures the forecloses and impact to the role of battle, but also because they also call their coalition in the permutation arguments, and the second argument that I go for is the subjectivity or performance argument that they're not properly handled. I will say in the Harvard evidence indicates affirmation of the myth of the minorities in an attempt to restrict political subjectivity, which disavows the impossibility of the entity for the slave and the savages, the integration rhetoric of that takes narrative of disenfranchisement, increasing possibility from a political basis for celebration of reform, i.e. the piece of conceded junk evidence that I read that indicates that we offer the minority as the hope to transform the U.S. political, economic, and cultural system. The value of humanity over capital accumulation of one is there when I see junk evidence. I will say in the Harvard evidence indicates that this alternative relocation of agency that attempts to carve out a space of freedom just resituates the civil society in order to revalue or demonize humanity, which is two the impacts. The first that is negation of blackness and the reconstruction of the reification of anti-blackness. Even if we don't want the ultimate, this is still terminal impact turn insolvency take out into the affirmative. You can know negative or consumption because what is Harvard evidence indicates that it is colonial humanism which restructures the political foundation of civil society. And the second is it allows the forces of force telling black major stories that require to disavow her status, distinguish her status as black agent so that she can tell the story about sexuality
filing, which is co-evidence in a meaningful way to white dominant colonial flavors leads to negation of what creating the basis for new forms of self-hatred are. You can see that Jones evidence also is an insight to the civil rights logic of the one I see is the one I see piece of with some juicy piece of evidence on the case to me, but also the logic and the whole foundation of the fucking dumb article or Jones evidence indicates that this civil rights logic is creates a basis for the settler slave state. It exists because the settler state exists in the paradox when which it calls for civil rights, but it's in capable of false political participation, which means that you don't have a structural analysis, even if you read this Argumentation evidence, because your structural analysis is only ever able to stop the war and guns and not the larger structure of anti-blackness, given that yes, we had crack, and now we have things like marijuana and selling whiskey, which is the air gun, which is that you don't get how blackness is constantly redefined and shifting to maintain the larger structural paradigm. You say dance with death, that's not you, because Wolfson is talking, indicating about giving up on subjectivity, not embracing one position and act on the world. You make the script argument, but read script error. You can see that anti-blackness means that minorities can never overcome their unique position because anti-blackness will always use the minorities to reify and form the one project back in, i.e. Asian Americans who become conscious of the anti-blackness become the new vision about minority impact turning into the affirmative, which means only the alternative can solve.
Did you subtract the prep? Like 320. I know it's 327 you used from the 6.
You had like two. I think you had 240 something.
Okay. We'll run prep. I'll figure it out. Thank you.
Yeah, so it's just one number.
Yeah, there's nothing I can say to
I
this.
haven't had to change it.
It's always fun, switching sides, right?
Never on the app, but you can't switch on the app. Fine, not bringing politics of it.
None of y'all have to switch sides.
It's gonna be overview, case, and then critique.
The question of this debate is whether or not it should continue to be used as a tool. White supremacy or not, the mono-minority myth must be disrupted. The junk evidence talks about historically, mono-minority myth has been constructed. You can trace it back to a New York Times article at the high point of the black political resistance movement, like what the Black Panthers and the Black Liberation Army, which is exactly the type of political movements Towson's 1 and Joa evidence says it's a good model means we are a prerequisite to the advocacy. The affirmative methodology requires revealing the complicity of the government and crimes against people of color to revolt with the mono-minority mutiny. The actions of the CIA and its joint oppression of Asian black bodies is proof how the actions of the state is inherently anti-blackness society we still live in is rooted in whiteness, naturalizing and erasing the gratuitous violence imposed on the colored bodies. We've made it clear this entire round that we do not believe in the possibility of reforming or redeeming the state for this reason. We don't have to be held to the parts that we didn't even read in the 1AC. Our argument here is that we are bringing down civil society through this method of refusing to be part, continue to be a tool of white supremacy. The negative only tells Asian Americans that effectively that they should be pushed back to the white side and stay over there. They don't provide alternatives. They don't provide a space where Asian Americans can fit in this movement. This ignores the ways in which the model minority has impacted Asian Americans' experience, in which my life is divided. If I don't fit into the success narrative of the model minority, and if I speak out, this is crucial. The idea that the idea that we can't participate with Asian Americans are too scripted us by us further, not for evidence that they read in the 2NC is proof that they're scripting and only telling us that we should continue to work on the side of white supremacy means that their movement can't work without first analyzing this model. This round is a form of activists calling green space and flipping on its head to return power to those who have been powerless. This is powerless. The criminalization of black bodies and xenophobia of Asians is a condition rooted in American Kentucky. That's the structural analysis we make with our Alexander Ted evidence. The only way to turn this back and expose the underlying justifications of this construction and a call for the examination of relation of other questions to anti-bias and standing in solidarity with the demand that our voice to be heard and active express justice is debated. The judge believes our method is an important method for resisting anti-bias and the other rounds they should vote off. There's no reason why the space of resistance can't ask the impossible question of returning Turtle Island to the savage. Your analysis relies on sympathy. Their analysis relies on the idea that Asian Americans are folding their experience and black experience, but their analysis fails to recognize it's not a simple combination of the experience, but rather a recognition of how these issues interact with the decision to work towards anti-blackness, which is the main issue here for both parties. Our first piece of junk evidence talks about how Asian Americans don't experience opposition in the same way as black bodies do, and we aren't scripted in the same ways by society, and recognizing these nuances and how we can fit into resisting white supremacy is important to our advocacy. They say that this is a foreclosed idea, but we are not foreclosed to resist the narrative closure that the CIA that the government put forth, that the CIA had no complicity in things like the drug war and Golden Triangle. By resisting this narrative closure, it leaves an open conversation about how the government has created to construct these ideas within the minds of America. They say that this side to the advocacy is that we are remaining on the white side and continue to be used as a tool. We have no place in this methodology. Only they say that we don't get a permutation, but it's a method by method debate. But if we win that at the starting point and already include their analysis, that means the permutation depot is the best option in this round, and the only way for Asian Americans to be included in this previously when they are previously absent in conversations like critical race theory, and they say that they voted for fairness. But first of all, when Asian Americans are already left out of the conversation, there's no fairness. Begin 1 second. Education is the most important in this round. So I was talking about this round is the only standard here. They say that we are we don't view this in attaching to normal historical ways of debate is a whiteness, but don't view this in the normal ways of perm. If our advocacy is removing a roadblock to better black liberation movements, we were always a permutation to begin with. We are turning against white supremacy. They say that the matrix creates this condition, but when we are challenging the broader question of how sexuality and white male dominant schemes play into how we are scripted as this, that means this is an inclusion of how the black female and black motherhood fits into the idea of how white supremacy is created, meaning that we still link through this argument. We are challenging this middle ground suffering that we are talking about, not universalizing our idea. We talk about how Asian Americans and blacks suffer both at the state, but in different ways. If you're still critiquing the same colonial structure, means that they are mutually exclusive. We are winning more than than they're winning, means vote, we are winning more than they're winning, which means vote Abby, don't get the parent versus the trans honestly. There is a terrible depressing anecdote. Trans women went to rally over a transphobic conversation, obviously not the app, or when I see Dunley talks, we need to send a circle on trans disabled queer cis woman, dark skin sicker Muslim, it's like a joke evidence, which is the Black Panther Party and the Black Liberation Army are really good models of violence, cross the white overview, all minority movements with the root downfall of these movements, which short circuits alternative women turning a respectably called politics argument from the blog because the mall minority fit myth is the foundation of the politics that there is a respectable minority who can succeed, who can have high incomes and commit less crime. Because of this, this is used to berate the Black body. If we remove this, this is a bringing down of these respectably politics, and we turn their sex and link. It doesn't account for all minorities. First, structural does involving coalitions. The app reform is uniquely good. They have no game on this other than some power tax cross apply the overview. 29 keeps Asians on the white side that was impacted above, and they say reformism, but don't let them lift out the complexes of the fungibility argument that they're talking about. They're taking something complete, something that we didn't even read when I see and saying, this is them, don't let them get away with their advocacy. This is just a silencing and further reiteration of the myth that we should stay docile to myths. It's pretty clear our advocacy believes in bringing that civil society, and this is foretelling, but we are revealing the structure with consent. Our co-evidence talks about how this is important to self-love and understanding, to have the best relation to ourselves. Our co-evidence always is pretty good. It talks about how we always find reasons and excuses. The negative is a contextualized example of another reason why Asian Americans another reason why Asian Americans should not be included in the movement. We don't need these excuses anymore. They say that we aren't asking for political engagement in the state or Asian American presence in civil society, but a radical shift in how the paradigm that we currently view race relations are not government evidence. Nurses, okay, the evidence sometimes discriminate Asians on the white side of the binary. This is what we're talking about when they continue to create the model minority. Their argument that anti-blackness becomes a new model minority ignores what being a model minority actually means. If Asians being conscious about anti-blackness is bad, then we would rather be on that side. The alternative is Asian Americans who only try to exist on the white side of the binary. They say that the big ground is about gaining consciousness, about understanding the just belief is a good idea, then he should put out.
Let's see the Young evidence and the Jones evidence.
Our Young evidence?
Well, yeah.
So is that the Towson TW?
Just the one, you just
Yeah, I'm
the
sorry.
one I see, because there's like 5 of them.
And the Jones evidence.
That's the 2 I see that. That's their one.
Which young evidence was like at the time actually?
Just,
I don't want to like.
And she says in the first piece, Young evidence, you leave it that one.
okay,
Oh, the black.
okay. This one? Yeah.
That's the part of the jump stuff.
I'll just have it open here. I'll make it bigger.
Y'all enjoying the People's Tournament? Y'all enjoying the People's Tournament?
I was really sick yesterday.
This one is 30 minutes. This one is
Not too much.
And like by the time I got back, like my body was taking from my heels to my shoulder, and my ankles was off.
You guys notice going up? I was talking about you during round 4. I was like, I'm nervous.
Start giving out speeches, so I can go like 4 separate things.
You ever tried like travel practice talking like
I need to, because if it's hard, you can see the trouble.
I've heard before you're like, you think you're clear. I came here last year, already matched my win total after round 4, so yeah.
So you what? You matched your
I matched my win total
I
last
love
year.
her
Last
match
year's
with
last year. We didn't have any extras.
What was your app? You were reading
We read music after against Don Baker, and it went terribly. This wasn't ready. We didn't think it would be T, and then they read T. Yeah, like thank you.
It's go to CC, right?
TV.
The D in milk is the
Yeah. Case list was messing up.
apparently lowercase letters.
They're not perfect, honestly.
Yeah.
We're going to that over quickly.
Yeah, I'm gonna.
saying like this was particularly a good round. I think there were a couple of structural things that could have made like vote either way much more easier. Uh, First, particularly, I think coming out of the one and C, I think y'all need to be very clear of like the questioning of the questioning of like the methodology that they provide. Right, I think that's the biggest issue I have coming out of the one and C, that there really isn't a sign of like real offense, right? And so it comes to like this question of methodology versus methodology debate, right? I think if you wanted to be more offensive here, you should have did a historical analysis, right? I think that John Carr only so specifically talks about like the Asian identity becoming a problem for the way in which blackness is criminalized in the 1960s, which historically don't make sense because the black has been criminal since slavery, right? So I think that a historical analysis would have put you in a better position to generate like actual offense. I think it could have just been a dissad about like controlling the count, like controlling the archives, right? I think that could have just been an effective strategy to generate offense at the same time, like give you leeway on this like methodology versus methodology debate. Which particularly I think is a good like starting point question, right? But I think that like just having a historical analysis just like legitimately dooms them because of the ways in which the one is structured around a particular instance in history where the Asian identity becomes one that problematizes like black identity. I think also when that is the contextualization, you need to be very careful of like them being able to ask like the historical questioning of things like property rights and property ownership, like the ability of like the slave, which like kind of the Bill of Sale stuff that Farley talks about has never like been removed from the plantation, which means that like any acts that blackness engage in will always be a form of criminalized act, right? I think there's a lot of better arguments you can make, particularly in relation to blackness and material conditions in the status quo, right? I think that's where your argument should be deposited on, right? That the ways in which the model minority myth is created is what produces like the notions of things like urban planning, things like population control, things like biopolitical power against like black and brown communities, right? And that the Asian identity become the ways in which they can I guess you could say rationalize the way in which violence can be produced. Like, oh, look, you can be just like them, right? And because you are not just like them, we can now exterminate you. We can produce the violence against you, right? I think that's your articulation. It produces a lot of like questioning that I don't think that like their analysis in the K gets to, which is the problem of like material conditions, how material conditions are formed in and of the status quo now, right? If our argument is that society produces this social violence predicated off of like black people being able to assimilate via like the ways in which the Asian assimilate, and the fact that like black people don't assimilate like that is the ways in which they create a trope of control of identity and how identity is proliferated in society. Right, so making the argument that the minority does not resolve the issue of the slave, right, but it does resolve the issue of material condition that exists in society today. Right? I think like if you frame the debate like that, it produces a lot more offense, right, that gets you away from the slave narrative. Also, just having some offense to like why like those kind of narrations of like black identity is bad in the status quo. I think the block could have been much more like offensive in the sense that like I think you don't do enough analysis on this Joy James argument. I think like if you're going to go for the starting point debate, I don't understand why there's not A, historical analysis, or B, a more tangible discussion about like how the process of the black woman kind of like production of slaves is how we get to the position that America is in now, right? Which means we predate your argument first. And second is that like because of the production value of the black woman's vagina, that's the only way that you can have an antagonism to society, right? The reason why there's a black-white binary is because the black will always be the polemic opposite of the whiteness, right? And that this is not a question of just black-white binary, but it's a question of how like society plays out identity, and not necessarily just identity as in I'm an Asian woman, but identity in the sense of like those who can possess privilege and those who can be dispossessed of all privileges, right? So it's a question of absolute dereliction versus the question of access and privileges. We say that when you disidentify from those privileges, right, what you have done is only proven that you have the ability to like be fluid within society. We don't have that ability. Right, that in itself is a dissad of the ways in which subjectivity is created and how subjectivity can be maintained by certain people, or not maintained for the sake of like having civil conversations about like racism and like black versus Asian and stuff like that. Also think the Sexton argument could have been blown up a lot more, right? I think particularly this was something I was expecting Troy to do a lot more work on, was just this notion of like colorblindness and like this notion of like multiracialism, right? And you could make these arguments of like a question of like, if these positions are about how we categorize race, then they won't ever resolve anything. Right, and I think like the entirety of like the entirety of the 2AC is predicated off of the way in which she identified, and not the ways in which she identified against systems of oppression. Right, I think you need to be very careful of that when you talk particularly about like the Asian identity. Right, I think you need to talk about it in terms of how anti-Blackness is created, and not in terms of how the Asian identity deals with violence. Right, I think if your argument is that like violence is created against the Asian body the same way it's created against the Black body because of the ways in which we can like control the ways in which like white supremacy, particularly white men, can control fantasies and desires about certain groups of people. Right, this is how anti-Blackness functions. Not about me talking about being an Asian woman. It's about the idea of how like our identities are mapped upon us and produces the anti-Blackness and violence that happens in the status quo. Right, I think they get a lot of like access to the subjectivity when like your argument is just like I'm an Asian woman and this is like the oppression I face. Right, I don't think that's the discourse of the 2AC, but I think you let them get you into this trap of you identify as this and it's something that we can never access. Right, I think if your argument is that because violence happens like this, right, violence is also or can be articulated in other formats in the same way, right, which kind of gets into this whole conflation debate, right? I don't think you should say that because we speak from a position of like the Asian woman, we also can incorporate things like Black women, right? I think that's conflation like anything. Right, I think the argument you need to make is that like speaking from like certain social locations, it explains how anti-Blackness works on multiple levels. Right, I can't speak for the Black woman, or I can't speak on the Black woman, right? But I can talk about like how like my identity creates violence against others, and how my identity also dictates violence for me. Right, I think your argument is like we also can solve with Black women is extremely damning, particularly when you're not answering back the James analysis, which is particularly talking about like the historical like ramifications of what it means to be a Black woman in society. I don't think you should read Nopper. I don't think Nopper was productive in any sense, right? I think if you're going to make an argument about like identity and the way in which identity protection, I think like going for like the multiculturalism, like the colorblindness argument was much more effective than like the Nopper argument, because I kind of agree with them to some level that it is a form of scripting which could be dangerous, right? But I also believe that like the argument is correct, just like the warranting of the argument is problematic. I think the 1 yard, first of all, I think in the 2AC, right, there should not have been a multiplicity of permutations, right? Two of the permutations were exactly the same thing, like do the AF or do the alt, because the alt is the AF, right? I think at the point where you create these kind of distinguishments, only prove that like you try to like crowd out kind of discussions of how the alternative and the 1AC functions as similar things or similar strategies. Right. I think if it is a methodology versus methodology debate, then the question becomes is whether or not these methodologies can be done simultaneously, and not necessarily that we can just do them all within the 1AC. I think the argument you should be going for is a question of like we can do these things simultaneously, right? Like is that we can acknowledge that there's an impossibility of giving back the slave subjectivity, right, or giving back the land in the case, which I think is the ways in which you address the Wilson evidence. Right, the Wilson-Hartman evidence, right? I think you can make that argument that we should also like produce that impossibility, but at the same time critique the ways in which that violence is, I guess you can say, mapped upon them through model minority, right? The biggest issue I have with a permutation that usually permutations don't have contextual ways of me like identifying how it resolves anything, right? Like do both, I don't know what that means. Right, particularly when like the only like level of answering you have for their alternative is that we can't get back the land, but nothing about the notions of like subjecthood for the slave, right, which is the warranting that they go for, which I think completely crowds out any of the defense that you're trying to generate against the alternative. And also it just makes the permutation seem like it really don't have a net benefit. Right, I think your articulation of the permutation is that like you should allow them to have this like have this possibility, but we should also like criticize the ways in which model minority happens. Right, these things cannot simply just exist against one another. Right, if anything, they are having these together and working simultaneously. Right, is the best way for us to address anti-Blackness. Right, that's a better articulation of permutation than do both. Right, I think if that's the articulation, it goes back into like the idea that like legitimately, even if their arguments are correct, right, it still is this like larger question of the material violence that is produced because of the minority myth, right, which I think gives you warrant for like why the 1AC is a net benefit, right? I think particularly in the 1AR, it should have been clean. I think you should have had like one analysis of what the permutation looked like, and you should have like you should have had some kind of defense to whether or not, even if I buy that the permutation is bad, that the app would still solve back for it, right? I think that's what you lose when you don't go for the other two alternatives, is the explanation of the permutation in reference to the affirmative, right? I think the issue I'm having is like, I don't know what the perm does for the app or for the neg. I think the 2R was shaky. I think like a large focus on like the link debate and like whether or not this is competitive is okay, but I think that like you should have went for this role of ballot claim, right? It's completely conceded in the 1AR, right? And if anything, I think that like this question of like the role of a ballot tied to like the trans link is uniquely important because you generate that as like unique offense that like how certain bodies don't get addressed when we have these discussions. I'm just like, yeah, that probably definitely turns the role of a ballot. But like that analysis is not in the 2R. There's a couple other things that I think could have been done more effectively. Probably like just more explanation of like the impossibility like alternative, right? I think you should also did like just like some real good calculative weighting of the alternative versus the affirmative, right? Your argument is that like I can vote for the AF even if like all you have to do is prove the AF is a bad idea, which I think is true. But at the same time, it's like if you can resolve issues of the AF as well, which is the structural antagonisms that are necessary, right? Then why not do it? Right, I think at the top they should have an explanation that specifically talked in reference to like the Hartman and Wilkes and stuff, right? Because the overview is just like these are arguments we're winning instead of the overview is let me explain the case to you. I think the 2AR was good. The issue is that I think that like there's a lot of things that you're behind on, particularly these disad/link work that's done on the permutation debate that I don't think like you get to a sufficient time to like make like offensive reasons why the app is a better idea, right? I think like they do a lot of like offensive like managing on the permutation debate that they then couple with like the link debate. Right, I think the easiest way out of this was to like probably kick the permutation, then just go for like solvency outweighs and answer back the fact that like they are really non-responsive to the fact that like your arguments are like all either non-unique decay or get you out of the link debate. Right, I think particularly the discussion of 1AC gets categorized as something that is bad, but I don't think it's bad, right? And I think particularly when they read the Jung evidence, right, against you, right, it does kind of counterwrite your Jung evidence, right? But at the same time, I don't think that it precludes the ability for us to engage in these like discussions of why it's important that we have scholarship and foundation about the consciousness that Asians need to engage in. Because if this issue is structural violence and Asians are keeping up that structural violence, then we should be able to challenge that as well. Right? I think if there was a bigger articulation of like solvency and just a better like framing of the solvency versus the K debate, that I could have probably evaluated like I could probably move away from a lot of like the offenses that generate on the link debate. But my problem, like the solvency question is always kind of left open, and also I just think that they're winning substantial offense to get the permutation or the affirmative alone, which is the reason why I vote Nick. Any questions or anything? Okay.
Thank you so much.